My name's Charles Raether. I'm managing partner here at AmLaw Group. And today we've got a very interesting presentation, something we've had in the works for a while, probably should have prepared a long time ago. Is something talking about, I don't want to call it the 6 deadly sins, but the 6 E-2 mistakes that clients often make when they don't work with us, of course, that can sink an E-2 petition. And the thing is, these are really resolvable issues that can be handled and addressed if done so properly and in advance of preparing your petition and going to the interview. But nonetheless, when we talk to clients who have worked with other attorneys in other contexts and for other E-2 petitions, and they have problems and they come to us, we've kind of put this together, this compendium of mistakes for E-2s that can sink an E-2 petition, but it's really frustrating because these are resolvable issues and people should not be suffering from them. So we thought we'd put together kind of an overview of this brief presentation talking about these 6 most commonly occurring mistakes that can be easily resolved and make sure that you get the approval for your E-2 petition for yourself and your family. Again, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Charles Raether, managing partner here at AmLaw Group, where for nearly 20 years we've been assisting clients in terms of handling their immigration to the U.S., whether it's E-2s, EB-5s, or talent-based petitions. So what do we want to talk about here? The issue. Most E-2 denials are avoidable, and that's definitely true. E-2 is one of our favorite visas, and one of the reasons it's one of our favorites is because it just doesn't have that many. It just doesn't have that many denials. I mean, we do an excellent job with approvals. We've never had a denial for a Canadian applicant or for an applicant from the UK. And that's true for the vast majority of other countries as well that we work with. So if you're not clear, I just want to do a quick rundown here's just a quick rundown of what those 6 cases are, 6 mistakes that are avoidable. And we're going to go into them more depth right here in the next couple slides and explain to you what you can avoid here and how you avoid them and you know, how do you take next steps. So for those of you who are not aware, here's what E-2 is about. Usually takes about 3 to 5 months from start to finish, from start until you get your visa at the embassy. You need to invest about $100,000. Could be less, could be 90. You don't want to go much below that. And you have to have citizenship of a qualifying country. You can go to the State Department's website. They have a list of all the qualifying countries. Maybe here in the description of this video somewhere too, we'll have that link. But a lot of benefits to it. And you can see here, we've got a number of those benefits, right? You can live and work here with pretty much the same benefits as a green card holder. The big difference between the E-2 and the green card is permanent. So you just renew it every 10 years, but you're what's called a permanent resident. Whereas with the E-2, it's not considered permanent because it's issued for a shorter period of time. And it's based on your owning and running successfully a business in the U.S. So if you close that business, if you sell it, you no longer have the grounds for the E-2. Most Western European countries, Canada, other countries, they get the visa for 5 years. Some countries get it for a shorter period. It really depends. So you have to check for your respective country how long the visa is issued for. But what are the good things about it? Your spouse gets an EAD. Your children can attend U.S. schools as local residents. And once they get to the age of college or university, they can attend public universities or colleges at in-state tuition fees as if they were U.S. citizens. So that's a big savings alone. If you know how expensive secondary education is in America and you have multiple kids, that alone is worth multiples of the fees you would pay us as your attorneys or might even invest in your business. And the good thing is there's no limitation on how long it's valid for. And, many clients, they might just renew their visa every 5 years. Now, what it requires is, again, like I said, you have to have qualifying citizenship. You have to have control of a U.S. company. You need to invest about $100,000. You have to spend most of that money before it has to be a legal business. And that means you can't do gambling. You can't do marijuana. Even though marijuana is legal in certain states, it has to be legal under federal law. Now, and we just mentioned some of the large countries, including China, India, Russia, and Brazil, who are not qualified for the E-2. But besides those large countries, a large number of countries are, and you'd be amazed what countries are qualified, including Iran, Pakistan, some other countries qualify as well for the E-2. So let's get down to the focus of today's topic, right? What are the mistakes that are most often occurring when people file their E-2s? First thing is understanding that any amount is a good amount. in terms of your investments. And sometimes if you do Chat GPT, which I'm really hesitant about doing with immigration related matters, Chat GPT might tell you, hey, you can invest just 50,000 and that's okay. I've been doing this about 20 years. 50,000 actually did work, maybe about 10 years ago. I wouldn't risk it now, although I've heard of cases from other attorneys, other people I've talked to, where the client just didn't have any more money and they still got approved. And your chances are that you might get approved if you were to invest only 50. But most clients don't want to take those risks. So we just kind of broke it out here in terms of, how much do you need to invest? Generally, we say if you're investing 100,000 or more, you're golden. There shouldn't be any problems. If you're in that range of 80 to 100, you should be okay in most cases. I'd say the risk is minimal. But there could be issues, and it really depends on how strong of a business plan you have, how strong of a business model you have. That's something you need to speak to us or any other experienced attorney who's been doing this a while and can say relatively quickly whether, this would work or not. Now, I know I've been talking about my credentials and how many years I've been doing this, and you would think that would teach me a thing or two. And I have to tell you, one thing that it has taught me is you never can be overly confident. For example, we recently had a client with an Italian passport was developing an aquaculture business in the US to raise oysters. Great business model, great investments, great business plan, super good background. He got a denial. I mean, we're just totally amazed. So no one is immune from stupid, decisions from the officers at the embassy. So again, there could have been something in the guy's background that he didn't like. Could have been just a bad day with this officer. He had an argument with his wife in the morning and was not in a good mood. I don't know, but I have to admit, this guy had one of the strongest E-2 cases we've ever dealt with, and he got a denial. So I'm not saying this to scare anybody. I'm just saying that you need to be realistic and prepared for the worst. Prepare for the worst and hope for the best, I guess, as they say, right? And so to that extent, investment amount needs to be in that range we'd like it to be. Certainly above 80. If it's at 100 or even more, that should make things good enough for you to raise, the chances for your approval. Mistake number 2, you want to make sure you're picking an appropriate business for the E2. And so this green list on the left indicates very commonly used business models. The one in the middle also are possible, but a little bit more problematic. And the one on the right-hand side is showing you really what does not qualify. And maybe we'll start with that first. Nonprofits, that rarely, occurs. Purely passive real estate, right? So if you buy 1 or 2 or even 3 apartments and, you're making good money, which you can, especially in the Miami area on rentals. But if it's a, 1-year leases you just rent it out, you talk to the tenant once every year when you renew the lease, that's considered a passive business. Real estate rental in general, for these purposes, is considered passive. Now, you could, as you see here in this middle column where we talk about real estate active operations, you can have a real estate rental business, a rental model where you have multiple apartments or houses and you're renting them out. But that means you have to have enough of those such that it constitutes a full-time business for you, right? So if you've got 1, 2, 3 apartments, even probably 4, it's not a full-time job for you to run those apartments, even if those are short-term rentals, maybe on Airbnb, it's still considered a passive business. And I'll get to in a moment what's considered active and how you could really do a real estate model for an E2. But if we go to some of these other disqualified business models, passive stock investments, again, meaning, you're playing the market. You might be a day trader and spending most of your day trading public equities, but that's still considered a passive activity. Right. And so that really would not work. But if we get to items that are more doable, structure dependent, single rental property LLCs, for example, that could work out theoretically if you just got one property, if it's a really big property. Maybe it's a 10-unit apartment building or 15-unit apartment building. That would probably satisfy. Or if you were doing an Airbnb model where you had multiple apartments, maybe you rent them long-term and release them on a short-term basis, or maybe you just bought like 5 apartments. I would say generally, this is a general rule of thumb, probably if you've got 5 units, 5 apartments or more, you probably could qualify that as an E2 business. And we've done that in the past successfully with a number of clients. But for them, it truly was nearly a full-time gig for them, or at least for one of the spouses. And they had several part-time employees, and we were able to put together a good case. Other items such as online businesses, there's no reason why an online business would be disqualified, but sometimes officers aren't too keen on that because they might say, look, if this is an online business you've been running remotely from Canada or Norway for the last 5 years, why now all of a sudden you need an E-2 visa to be in? The response I would say, or the case that we prepare for our clients is usually saying, look, we've done online successfully for the last few years. We want to develop now in the offline realm. Now, whether you're really going to focus a lot on the offline world or not, that's something nobody's really going to challenge you on later, right? So, we would build a business plan talking about developing offline sales, giving arguments or explanations why you need to physically be here in the US, how that's going to help the business. And the main thing is to get the approval at that point. In the future, there really shouldn't be any problems with getting a renewal for something of that nature. What are other businesses that might be problematic? A business that's netting you, 40,000 or less, they just might consider that, an immaterial business. It's more of a hobby, right? That this isn't really a business. You're certainly not supporting your family on that money. And they might suspect, hey, this is a case of a form leading substance, and you're just doing this E-2 to get a presence in the US. You're not really building a business or making money off of that. So that's something to keep in mind. On the left here is just a number of popular business models. But again, you're not limited to this by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, I would say almost any business qualifies for an E-2. I mean, again, with the exception of some of these items that we discussed. And that's one of the beauties of the E-2. It's just very, very flexible, very versatile. Here's mistake number 3 that clients don't always understand. You just can't park the money in your U.S. company's account. You've got to put it at risk. So sometimes when we say clients, you've got to invest 100,000, they say, okay, I'll put 100K into my business. I'll spend 20,000 of it. I'll need the rest. I'll just leave it in the business account. That will not fly. That will not work, folks. What we generally advise clients on is you want to spend probably 50, 60,000 before you file. So here it says invested. It should say, these funds are already spent by the time you file. That could be, improvements to your lease, your office space, buying tools, equipment, buying inventory even. That should be here as well, that you're buying inventory. You're spending roughly 60% prior to filing. The remaining amount, in this case, it would be, say, 40,000. We need that to be committed towards future business expenses. And what does committed mean? It doesn't mean you have a Google Ads account where you spend 2,000 this month, 5,000 next month, you turn it off completely the month after that. No, there's no financial commitment on behalf of your company, right? You're just making expenditures. They want to see a legally binding agreement. That could be an employment agreement for somebody that you're hiring. It could be a lease agreement. It could be maybe, equipment purchasers or equipment leases. But it's got to be something that says, hey, in the course of the next year, I've got to spend this money. And so we want to have agreements that total approximately for the remainder of the amount that you haven't spent prior to the filing. So in our example, it'd be roughly about 40,000. You can always leave maybe 10,000 for just operating capital and expenditures. So stuff like this, where you've got, just funds coming in, or you have cash still in your personal account, et cetera, none of that is going to work. So again, we want to show roughly 50, 60% spent before filing, the remainder committed, and we don't want to have a whole lot sitting in the bank. This can lead to denials in many cases, and sometimes attorneys are not too good at clarifying this for clients. Next issue, item number 4, is proving where the money came from. Source of funds is an important task, an important requirement for the E-2. Fortunately, it's not as difficult with the E-2 as it is with the EB-5. EB-5, we got to trace everything back to that first dollar that you owned. With the E-2, it's a lot easier, right? And so what are common sources for E-2 investments? People might sell real estate. They might not even sell real estate. They might use a HELOC, which is basically a secured loan, as we indicate down here, right? You might have business sale proceeds. Either you could have dividends, for example, from your business, or you might sell the business outright. Might have employment savings. You might have a gift from a family. So based on your source of funds that you're using, we would have to customize the list of documents we would need from you. So we just don't have enough space here to really kind of get into the details. If you're selling real estate, we need to show, the purchase contract, who's buying it from you, settlement statement, bank statements, et cetera. Now, sometimes it's extremely rare, I would say, for clients from Canada and the UK and similar countries. Sometimes people coming from more developing countries, they might say, oh, we see you sold your house for $500,000. You're investing $100,000 now in the E-2. Show us where you got the money to buy your house. Sometimes it comes up. It's rare. And I think it's either a case of of officers confusing E-2 with EB-5, because with EB-5, you need to go back and show where that original money came from. Or they really have some serious doubts about the applicant, and that's why they're giving them a hard time and saying, oh, we see you sold your house. That's not good enough evidence. We want to see how did you buy the house? Did you use clean money to buy the house, et cetera? Again, very rare, comes up in less than 5% of the cases. But sometimes, we generally warn clients, look, are you prepared if they ask us for this? Could you show us where you got the money to buy the house, for example, if you're coming from one of those countries? Other problem that comes up, mistake number 5, is filing your petition before the business is ready. So what does that mean? First, here's one thing. It's kind of like our motto down here. We only file when the business is ready, not when the client is. Clients are in a rush. They want to get things filed. And we might be like, hold on here. We got to get everything lined up first with your business. And so what are common mistakes that come up that with a business that could lead to problems? They might not have all the business licenses in place. It's okay if you don't have all the licenses, but if you have the main ones in place, usually that's okay. Equipment might not be purchased or installed. Inventory might not be ready. Here's the thing to keep in mind, and it's kind of mentioned here in our point here, the turn the lights on standard. I think that's a good way of putting it. You basically have to have the business all set up such that when you go in for your interview, or if you're doing it in the US, you won't have an interview, but when you file the petition, everything is basically ready for the business. All that's left is just you're ready to start and able to start before filing or before your interview. By all means, do so. And you should talk to your attorney to make sure that this, makes sense and something you can do. But it's generally a good thing to have an ongoing business, because it's not only then a plan at that point, it's a reality. And you can say, look, I've got an active business. Here's our cash flow, here's our revenue for the last couple of months, stuff like that. That always creates a better impression. You're not obligated to start it, but it always creates a better impression. So what are problems, that can come up in terms of the business? If there's a long build out, right? If it's going to take 6 months for you to build out the space to start your restaurant. That can be a problem, because we really can't file the petition before everything is ready there. And so if you file, you still got 2-3 months to get your final permitting done, to get the table set up and, the kitchen all organized. That's not going to work for an E-2. You've got to have everything ready by the time we file that. So business models that have a long lead time, or let's say development of undeveloped land, right? It takes you a long time, right, to get the foundation in, to get all the permits, stuff like that. Unless your business is literally a development business, they're going to build this house and that house and go from there. Real estate development generally does not lend itself too well to E-2 visas, precisely for that reason as well. Here's item number 6, underestimating the consular interview. So there's 2 ways of approaching an E-2. You can change your status in the US, or you can file at the consulate. The vast majority of our Canadian, British, Western European clients file at the consulate. I would say partially that's due to the fact that there's very few denials for these countries at the consulate. And it's generally more advantageous to get the interview done at the consulate, because you're going to get a visa for 5 years. Whereas if you come to the US as a tourist, and the first problem is, with the exception of Canadians are the only ones who can do this. Canadians can come to the US without a visa, and then they can change their status to an E-2. Everybody else can't. Why is that? Because the Canadians have a special treaty with the US, lucky folks, that is different from the ESTA program. So the ESTA program is what controls everybody else, Europeans, Aussies, other people, right? ESTA is where you can come to the US for 90 days at a time. You don't need a visa, and you just have to leave, and you can come back and forth. But one of the limitations of ESTA is you cannot change your status in the US. Canadians are lucky. They get to come here for up to 180 days at a shot. And since it's not part of the ESTA program, they can, in fact, change their status while they're here. I can't remember the last time we've had a Canadian change the status here. The only time I can think where as a Canadian you want to change your status is if you have some admissibility problems. So you might have something in your past that might raise the chances of a denial at the embassy, but that is not grounds for a denial for a change in the US. That's the only reason I can think of that. For this scenario, we're going to go off the assumption that you're going to go to the embassy And again, I think for the most people, that's the better way to go because you don't have to sit here, wait 90 days before changing status. You file at the embassy, you get in for the interview, boom, you get a visa for 3 years, 5 years. You never have to go back to talk to an American bureaucrat during that time. But here's the issue. There can be risks at the embassy. The denial rate at embassies has always been higher than in the US. In 15 years of our practice, we've had one denial of an E-2 in the US. Unfortunately, I can't say that overseas. Now, again, a lot depends on your nationality. Like I said, we've never had denials for British citizens or for Canadians, but we have had denials for others, especially in more developing countries. The denial rate is higher. Maybe it's 10%, maybe even 20% might get denials. Really depends on a lot of geographic, geopolitical factors, stuff like that. But having said all that, so whether you're Canadian or British or wherever you're from, you got to be prepared for the interview. And it's kind of mentioned here. You get one officer, one decision with zero appeal opportunities and zero explanations. And like I said, we just had that Italian gentleman, super strong case, he got denied. Good luck, right? And I don't mean to be flippant about it, but when you get a denial at the consulate is kind of like the judge, the jury, and the executioner, right? They decide the facts, they decide the law, and they make the decision, and they mete out the punishment. And there's not a whole lot you can do to change that. If you do get a denial at the embassy, what are your options? It really depends on the case and the circumstances, but generally the best option is just refile later. You can file what's called a request for supervisor review and stuff like that, but 99 out of 100 times that's going to go nowhere. Just your option is to refile. Again, how quickly you could refile and what the circumstances would be depends on the reason for the denial. And so that's why it's really important to try to get information from the officer why he or she is denying you. But unfortunately, they don't always tell you. So that's the issue. So this interview is high stakes, no matter what. For Canadians and Brits, it's less risky than others, but it's still high stakes because if they deny you, boom, you can't come to the US on your E-2. I mean, it's over. So you need to be prepared to have a prep session with me personally for our E-2 clients. We go over the likely questions. What do you need to talk about? What should you not talk about? It's amazing sometimes I shouldn't say amazing, but people don't always understand the nuances, right, of an interview, and they don't understand what the officer is going to be looking at. And sometimes we've had clients that went in for interviews. They didn't give us the full lead time. They didn't tell us about the interview. They went on without talking to us and they had problems. So you want to be careful about what you say, how you say in the interview, and we train people on that. We anticipate the questions they ask, and we know what kind of questions, what's of importance to certain people in certain embassies, and what to focus on and stuff like that. And then you always want to have a backup plan in the worst case scenario. We actually have a guide how to ace your consular interview that we should have a link here as well that you can download. It's a great little guide oversight based on our experience as well as our conversations with consular officers, where they literally say, how do we look at people? We're humans as well. If the person looks kind of shaggy and looks kind of rough and, doesn't look like a decent person, psychologically, it's going to leave, some kind of, afterthought in the officer's mind. So even things as basic as, look professional, dress well, be polite, don't blame other officers. If you had a denial previously or stuff like that, don't speak poorly of other consular officers. Kind of the basic courtesy and etiquette issues go a long way when dealing with consular officers. So if you're not familiar with us, this talks a little bit about us, how we've done, how we've been doing the last 20 years, and hopefully we'll repeat it over the next 20 as well. So, this talks a little bit, what we focus on. We're a small firm, but small translates into high attention, high quality in our mind as compared to larger immigration practices. So here's, just a few words about some of our clients that they have to say about this. We pride ourselves on our work with our E-2 clients, and we would love to welcome the opportunity to do so with you as well. So, here's contact information. If you have this presentation directly, there's links here that you can can use to contact people, contact our business development director, Alex, to set up a consultation, go over the particulars of your case, whether you filed an E-2 in the past. We can do an analysis to see what was wrong and what would be changed to have a successful new case. Or if this is your first attempt at an E-2, more than happy to go over your plans, probe it for weak spots, give you advice how to shore those up and ensure that you and your family have a very successful and pleasant and expeditious transition to the US, whether it's with an E-2 or any other visa. Again, thank you everybody for being with us. Please feel free to reach out to us with the contacts below or here in the presentation to set up a consult for yourself to get started on your transition to the US.